works of Jehovah. They were ignorant of what God had done for Israel, his church. You see, by the works of his hands, God reveals himself to us. Oh, yes, we only understand those works in the light of his word. That is true. But there's no other way in which God makes himself known than through his works. His word only reveals his works. And God works in such a way that his people experience those works. They experience those works in their own lives and in their own hearts and observe them on their own pathway and in that of their generations. That's what God had done for Israel. The entire history that preceded this generation was a revelation of the marvelous grace of God. It was a history of wonderful things. Their very origin was by a wonder. I speak not merely of the wonder by which all of us are brought into the world, fearfully and wonderfully made, as we read in Psalm 139, but the history of Israel was a history of a seed being born from two who were as good as dead. The birth of Isaac to Abraham and Sarah was a birth of one from those who were so far past the age of childbearing that they were as good as dead. God brings forth his seed from an impossible situation. That wonder, however, was repeatedly revealed in the history of this great nation. The wonder of the Lord's hand among them, the wonder of their salvation, could not possibly have been revealed more clearly than in their deliverance from the land of Egypt. When Moses parted the Red Sea as the instrument of Jehovah for Israel to walk through on dry ground, and when God brought those walls of water crashing down upon Pharaoh and all his hosts, destroying them in the depths of the sea for the deliverance of his people, by which baptism was signified. He revealed himself as Jehovah God by the works of his own hands. His miraculous provision for his children in the wilderness, his deliverance of a rebellious people, even by Moses lifting up the serpent, his constant faithfulness to them, even when it was necessary that he chasten them severely and punish the evildoers in their midst, his bringing them into the land of Canaan across the Jordan River and giving them that land that was occupied by giants and fierce enemies. Why, all these things were the works by which God revealed himself to Israel as Jehovah, who alone saves his people. And, this is the most important thing of all those works of Jehovah, which this generation did not know, were the works of God which revealed Christ, the coming Messiah, to the Old Testament church. Of all these things, this new generation was grossly ignorant. They knew them not. Now you understand why this was, don't you? This gross ignorance, this emptiness of salvation, was the result of parents neglecting to teach them diligently unto their children. Let's not misunderstand. This ignorance does not mean that they had no knowledge whatsoever of their history and tradition. It's never the case that one generation stands steadfast while their children are ignorant as those coming from a third world country who never heard the gospel. Remember, there is the passing of some time here between the death of Joshua and the death of the last elders who served with him. And during that time, there was obviously a weakening of the nation from the viewpoint of their spiritual zeal and knowledge. That's very evident in the first chapter of the book of Joshua. But you see, by this time, there were none left of that generation that had actually lived through that history of the entrance into Canaan. Just like there are none here. Very few in any of our churches who lived through the church history of 1924 being direct participants in those events. Even our oldest members would have been but young teenagers at the most at that time. For that matter, none of our active ministers and none of the active office bearers in our denomination, to my knowledge, were participants in the Reformation of 1953 in our churches. The generation of which our text speaks was far removed from those events of their ancestors. And therefore the history, though perhaps a matter of faint knowledge, was not a vital experience for them, had no vital interest to them. They failed to see that in history, God had been forming to himself a people to show forth his praise, a people who would be saved by the wonder of grace in the coming of the Messiah. Now I want to take a moment just to make an application to our children. Because I know sometimes, boys and girls, you're not always so eager to learn certain things, are you? There are some things in school, for example, that interest you, and there are other things that, well, you're not so eager to learn. But do you realize that everything that you are taught in school reveals the works of God to you? Everything. Do you know that when you study science or history, you are witnessing the handiwork of our Creator God and learning how He has been saving His church throughout all the history of the world? Do you understand that when you study math, you are standing before the God of all order, who calls us also to live in an orderly way? You see, all your education in our schools is meant to stand you before the knowledge of God and is intended to serve you in such a way that the relationship in which you stand to our Savior is an intimate covenant relationship of fellowship and love. And that's because your parents and the members of this congregation understand the importance of obedience to God in training you